Hi, class. As we wind down this whole class on the letter of James, I hope that you've been able to see in this very short letter that James is really about identity more than anything else. Because this is a critical issue in early Christianity or the early Jesus movement. They didn't have the New Testament at all, and the scriptures that they had were the Hebrew Bible. That really didn't show them the way that this Jesus movement was supposed to be structured. And Jesus really didn't leave detailed information down with the disciples about how to structure the entire early Christian movement. And so leaders like James and Peter and John, who were kind of these established leaders in Jerusalem, and leaders like Paul, who was a more itinerant type minister, they were really kind of creating the early Jesus movement as they were in process of living it out. You hear a lot of analogies about building this plane as we fly it. Well, that's really what they were doing. And in such a diverse setting as the Greco-Roman world, from Rome to Jerusalem, all through North Africa, Alexandria, Egypt being a really important spot for the early Jesus movement, just north of Palestine in Syria or Asia Minor, in Greece and Macedonia. The early Jesus movement was really all over the place. And there wasn't a single person or people in charge of those different places. So early Christianity grew up in a very diverse setting. So the way the Jesus movement looked in Jerusalem, and even outside of Jerusalem in Judea, it looked real different than what it looked like in Syria around Antioch. And we have a lot of correspondence about Antioch with Paul's letters. The Acts of the Apostles has a lot of work about Antioch. There were early Christian writers from Antioch. So we have some good idea about what those particular Christians or early Jesus followers, what they believed and how they were interacting and the problems that they were facing. But the picture that we get isn't a picture of mass uniformity. It's really a picture of incredible diversity. And that diversity was hard to manage early on. And that gave rise to a lot of the earliest conflicts, specifically around how to incorporate Gentiles into the movement and what to do since Jesus' coming back was delayed. This was an apocalyptic movement. They really did believe Jesus was going to come back before they died. And when he didn't, this gave them really big questions like, well, was it true? And what do we do now? And you see that the writings in the later parts of the New Testament start addressing these kind of issues. So those are two primary issues that the early Jesus movement had to face. And the letter of James is a part of that discourse, specifically about how to live in the Roman world. And James negotiates identity from a very purist standpoint, right? Pure and undefiled religion before God is this: to keep oneself unstained by the world and to take care of the orphan and widow in their distress. So that's kind of James's standpoint. Excuse me. From that, we get another section, right? James is definitely, from a purist standpoint, opposed to Roman hegemony or Roman acquiescence. He doesn't believe in mixing with Rome. He believes that there's a strong line between the Roman world and the kind of world that he envisions. So you get a real different kind of take in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, where he's so against the Roman patronage system. And chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, he's really against the land ownership mechanism that governed the Roman world. And then right in the middle of it, you get this 15 through 18, or 13 through 18, where he critiques wisdom from the world versus wisdom from God. And so throughout the whole letter, James has two worlds: the world that belongs to Rome and the heavenly world, the world that belongs to God. And these two are in direct opposition throughout. So the worst kind of person in James's mind, outside of kind of the Roman contamination, is any kind of person who believed in Jesus that would transgress the boundaries that James has created here between the Roman world and the kingdom of God. And I think it's clear within the letter of James that people like the Apostle Paul were people who muddied the waters for James. So James is against the Roman Empire, but he's also against any kind of hybridity that would be a friend of the world and also try to be a friend of God. And that's where James just draws a strong line. And Paul actually says that in his letter to the first letter to Corinthians. He says, to the Jew I became as a Jew, to a Gentile I became as one, as a Gentile, so that I could win some. I'll become all things to all people so that I might win some. I think that's exactly the kind of cultural hybridity that James is fiercely against, and really kind of says so throughout his letter. So in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, the faith works binary, works is absolutely a part of it. And a faith that doesn't have works isn't faith at all. And that, I think, the works that James is talking about there is all facets of the Torah. It's not just moral law. It is ritual law. I don't think James makes those kind of distinctions. And that's exactly the kind of distinctions that Paul makes in his letters. Next section of James, you got 3, chapter 1 through 12, where James is criticizing rival teachers and really kind of censoring what they're saying by talking about the tongue as an evil. So James there is trying to censor his opponents and saying, don't listen to them. They don't even talk right? They're just a flame. They're a fire that burns a whole forest. So in these two sections, James is criticizing that kind of cultural hybridity, specifically among rival teachers. And then in the second section, after you get the wisdom two ways, you get this real critique of friendship with the world and friendship with God in chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. And then verses 13 through 17, where he criticizes these traveling merchants, or what I think are traveling preachers, or itinerant ministers. So James clearly says within the community, you can't be friends with the world. If you're friends with the world, you're at enmity with God. And then he says, these traveling ministers, if they think that they can just go traveling willy-nilly and never include God into the equation, then they're wrong too. And their business is corrupt from the beginning. Now, this could be Paul traveling around as a tent maker, or to be even more specific to what Paul talks about a lot is this offering that he's taken up for the saints in Jerusalem, is what he says. So this could be a real criticism of Paul or people like Paul who are traveling as itinerant ministers to start churches or preaching churches. And James is saying, listen, you what you're doing is wrong because you are being friends of the world, and you're trying to be friends of the world and friends of God at the same time. So there, James draws this strong distinction between the community of Jesus followers and the world, and criticizes internally those who think that they can have it both ways. There, I think that's where the word dipsukos, double-minded, is the way it's usually translated. I've been trying to argue throughout it's two-faced. I think that's a better captures what we say in modern terms in important ways. So James is anti-Roman Empire, but also anti-Pauline hybridity, just about at every level. So the entire body of the letter, chapter 2, verses 1 through chapter 5, verse 6, fluctuates between a critique of Roman imperialism and Pauline hybridity from the standpoint of a nativist position, this pure and undefiled identity that James is creating in opposition to Roman Empire. That's one way that he negotiated his personal identity, and encouraged all those in the diaspora to negotiate theirs. So I think that's, in sum, the letter of James. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope you've learned a lot about these 5 chapters in the readings and in the lectures that you had. And I think hopefully the midterm and your paper and all the quizzes that you've had have kind of provoked you to think more deeply about the letter of James. And at the end of the day, if you're studying this to be a pastor, I hope it's informed the way you think about your own ministry, how you negotiate your own identity in the modern world, and how you encourage your congregations and others to negotiate their identity in such a complex cultural situation that we have here in America. I hope it's been helpful in the way you think about not just the letter of James, but your own particular ministries as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I'll try to respond to those as fast as possible. Be well.